Institute, AP European History, Distance Learning. I hope you're all doing well this week, and I hope you've enjoyed reading the next section in the Spielvogel chapters 20 and 21. And it is just absolutely fantastic to be broadcasting to each and every one of you. So as we begin here, let's do a little contextualization. So this chapter, or actually technically the first half of two chapters that you are discussing, is really what happens in Europe right after our last time period ends. And the last time period ends in 1815, at the end of the French Revolution, at the time that Napoleon had finally been vanquished, and the upstart popular revolution of the French has now been finally put down, and Europe has been restored back to its former conservative glory, as you see the monarchs of Europe really restoring the balance of power at the Congress of Vienna, instituting the Concert of Europe, and trying to pick up the pieces to where the French Revolution had left, trying to rebuild Europe back to the way it was. And so, in the first part of chapter 21, you read about the conservative order, or maybe it was 20, whichever one talks about the Congress of Vienna. But the other part of the chapter that you were reading discusses another trend that was happening during the same time as the French Revolution, and then eventually through the first half of the 19th century, that is going to cause conservatism to and the old way that Europe was structured to just not be able to continue. And that's the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is going to dramatically shift pretty much everything in Europe. It's obviously going to change the economy and the way that Europeans are going to earn a living, particularly since now, for the first time since the agricultural revolution, it is no longer farming that is the primary occupation of many people. It is now going to be working in some sort of business, either as a factory worker, as a clerk, a business owner, a merchant, or something. And we're going to see shifts in the social structure of Europe, especially as we see the rise of the middle class, as we see this new working class, as peasants are moving away from the old farms and manors and into the cities to work in these factories, and we see changing cultural patterns as well as we look at just the creation of kind of a mass society and a common popular culture, as now you see especially more people living in cities, and eventually as we get out of this first half of the 19th century, as we get into the raising of the standard of living. But what we're studying now is kind of the beginnings of industrialization, and how the beginnings of industrialization really did dramatically shift Europe. And so, on the one hand, we're looking at how European monarchs are trying to put Europe back to the way it was, to go back to those good old glory days of feudalism, with, a little bit of enlightenment here and there, just to be scientific and all. But really, they wanted to just maintain the status quo in Europe. But as we look at a lot of the effects of the early Industrial Revolution, we're going to see that those trends and themes and impacts are gonna make it so that conservative Europe can no longer exist the way it was. So you've been looking at different ways that the Industrial Revolution had changed European society. And one of the most fascinating things that I love to look at is the way that it changed working patterns. Now, we're specifically going to look at the way it changed working patterns for those who were doing a majority of the labor. We're going to look at how working patterns for those laboring classes. Now, I'm calling them laboring classes because as we look at kind of the beginning of our time period, we're going to be looking at the way agricultural labor happened, at the way that those who worked in guilds in cities worked, the way that peasant women worked in what's known as the cottage system or the putting out system. And then we're going to shift into how that changed as workers are now leaving the farms and going into factories. And as we look at this, I just want to make sure something is kind of clear. As we look at particularly the way that people used to work before the Industrial Revolution. If you were a peasant or you were a tradesperson, you owned the means of production. You owned the human capital, the knowledge, the know-how. You owned the physical capital. You owned the tools necessary to produce whatever it was you were doing, either growing crops and or being a carpenter or a mason or something like that. But you were in charge of that. As we head into factories, workers are no longer going to own the means of production. And in fact, the only really instead of somebody's finished product being what they earn a living off of, it's now going to be simply their time and their labor. And so this is a huge shift that has had a lot of implications for even the way that we work today. And the last thing I'm going to say about this is, as you're studying this, I hope you're also realizing that we're actually going through another one of these changes right now. Now, obviously, this whole pandemic and quarantining has dramatically shifted the way that I do work. But even in the way that we see the gig economy, even the way we see working for tech companies, and we see newer companies are starting to change, even those things that came out of the Industrial Revolution. We're seeing less of an emphasis on coming into work at a specific time. We're seeing more of a finished product based working system where you're given projects and you're essentially assessed and graded on or paid for you finishing said project. So it's really interesting to see how working conditions and the way that we organize our working lives is shifting, not just in the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, but now even today as we're getting into the 21st century and starting the second decade, or I guess technically third decade in the 20th century. So just fascinating little parallels to today. So here's how this assignment works. You have an assignment. You have a Google Doc assignment that has been linked to both in Neo, but also on our Google Doc. And it's not a traditional DBQ in that I don't have the documents in little boxes with all the instructions. But if you were to do step 1, it would be to read the directions. Well, there are the directions. Step 2 is to break down the prompt. So let's look at our prompt here. Analyze the extent to which the development of factories changed the working conditions of the lower classes circa 1750 to 1890 CE. So you're going to be looking at the extent to which means you're going to be saying it somewhat changed and mostly stayed the same, or it mostly stayed the same and somewhat changed. Right? You're going to decide between one of those two options. So you're analyzing the extent to which the development of factories changed working conditions. So you're specifically going to be looking at each of these documents and saying, okay, how did people work? What were those working conditions? What were the hours like? What was the type of labor like? Who owned the means of production? How are people earning wages? What are all those sorts of things that we see occurring both before the Industrial Revolution, before factories, and then after factories? So you're going to be using these documents in the PDF that I linked to the assignment. Now there are more documents in this PDF than I want you to look at. You're going to be looking at a total of 8 documents total. And some of these documents are a little bit longer. You can see this one is an example of a longer document. Others of them are going to be pretty short. So for example, you're literally going to be looking at this work year in the 17th century France, which is really cool because you'll see all the different days off that they had. And you'll say, hey, how come we don't get those off from school? And then all of a sudden you're going to be promoting a Catholic education. But neither here nor there at this point. So you're going to be looking through these documents. I have the documents I want you to focus on here labeled in the left-hand column. So you can see document 1, skip document 2, 3, 4, 5, and then go to 8, 9, 11, and 12. So it's a total of 8 documents. For each of the documents, I want you to do a HIPPO, so a HIP analysis and an outside information. That would be kind of like going around the horn. And then I want you to, from the documents, just record some evidence on working conditions that you find from each of them. I don't need you to fill these boxes to the absolute brim. Maybe try to find at least 3 to 6 pieces of evidence for each document. The first segment of documents is going to discuss the old way, so that's going to be kind of the before. And then the second set is going to be discussing the new way, after factories had been developed. And so you're going to be seeing, by looking at all of these documents, what those changes and continuities are. And so that's going to, once you do that first part, you're then going to be led to the second part. And this is part of your document analysis. First, I just want you to look at the first set of documents and describe the old way of working. What was working like before the Industrial Revolution for people in Europe? Then I want you to describe the new way of working. Once these factories came about, what was it like to be a worker in this industrial era, especially the early Industrial Revolution? Then you're going to start doing what I call grouping the documents. Now, you practiced grouping the documents last week. I gave you the groupings at one point, and you had to tell me which documents fit into those groups. Then I gave you the documents, and then you had to figure out from how those documents fit together and create your own. Now I want you to just do it on your own. So I want you to find two continuities. So I want two groups that show a way that working stayed the same, but from before and after the Industrial Revolution. And then I want you to just tell me what it is and then which documents prove it. So for example, just write doc 1, doc 4, doc 6. In fact, you can just write the numbers. 1, 4, 6 would have been fine. Then I want you to find two changes from these documents. What's two way that work shifted and was different from the time period previously? And then again, tell me which documents prove your argument. Between these two, I want you to make sure that at least two of your categories are going to include all of the documents. I'm going to say that one more time. Between these two, so between your continuities and your changes, you need at least a continuity and a change, and between those two, it needs to make sure that it uses all 8 of the documents. Because then what you're going to do, and what you would normally do, is you're setting up, if you were to, you're not going to, but if you were to write a DBQ essay, these two segments here would become your body paragraphs, would become your major arguments. So I want you to practice finding your arguments, figuring out which 2 or maybe 3 help you to make sure all of the documents are used, and then I want you to transition that to a thesis statement. So just a 1, maybe 2 sentence thesis statement from the prompt above. So again, this prompt here, I want you to answer in a thesis statement. So analyze the extent to which the development of factories changed in the working conditions of the lower classes from 1750 to 1890. Again, just to make sure, you are going to be deciding that as you find their continuities and changes, well, does it mostly change and somewhat stay the same? Or does it mostly continue and somewhat change? Please make sure that you use the words mostly and somewhat in your thesis statement. Also, last point I'm going to say, don't forget that once you use whichever arguments you choose from here, I want you to also start to John Mayer them. So give me a phrase that explains why it would continue and why it would change. So that's essentially the assignment for this first part. I hope you have fun with this. Again, this is one of my favorite of the Weisner document activities that we do, mainly because this really sets up kind of the way that we even see the working world. And despite all the changes we're seeing happening now, this is something that has really defined even my life and the way that I live, and in a lot of ways it's going to define the way that you live as well as you eventually get a job either after high school or more likely after college. So enjoy and have fun with this, and if you have any questions, please email me. Until next time, off it all out.